Perfect. So we're going to start our last workshop session of this wonderful conference with Meg Perret, The Complicated Sex Life of Endangered Species, representation of giant pandas, reproduction in captive breeding programs. And Meg is a PhD student at Harvard in the history of science. Here we go, Meg. The floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you all see my slides? Yeah, and the slides changed, right? To check, yeah, okay. I actually just finished my PhD as of August 1st, so I'm now a postdoc at Harvard.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna get started here. So my talk here today is looking at the influence of cultural norms of gender and sexuality on how giant pandas are portrayed in captive breeding programs. So I'm trained as a historian of science. What I study is the relationship between scientific rhetoric that conservation biologists use to talk about endangered species and representations of endangered species sexualities in broader cultural contexts, such as popular science magazines and documentary film. What I find through my study of this is that both scientific and cultural representations of endangered species persistently describe them through reference to human gender and sexual stereotypes that are normalized and naturalized. In particular, in this case study, what I find is that the reproduction of endangered species is articulated through reference to a perceived crisis of the future of masculinity and heterosexuality. So as a symbol of the environmental nonprofit World Wildlife Fund, the giant panda has possibly raised more funds for conservation than any other species, yet scientists are still really struggling to get them to reproduce reliably in captive breeding programs. So in the 1990s and the early 2000s, scientists, especially surrounding the San Diego Zoo, really looked into the question of why there was such issues in getting giant pandas to reproduce in captivity. And what we see on the slide here is the results of that inquiry. So what they really found was that there was a what they call like a lack of male sexual motivation that was causing the mating not to occur. And so really there was like an emphasis on abnormal male behavior that was happening in captivity. And so this was picked up by the media in describing sort of the issues that arose around captive breeding of pandas. What we see here in the image is allegedly a panda watching panda porn, which in this clip is are recordings of other pandas mating. And this was thought to help get male pandas in the mood. And this is portrayed in Scientific American, and the quote that I want to pull out here is that they say pandas are endangered in part because the males often prefer eating to mating. Giant panda dudes in captivity would rather sit around and munch on bamboo than get it on with females. So we have this emphasis on issues with male behavior that was occurring because of the conditions of captivity. So there was sort of a media frenzy around this, and this is a list of some of the outlandish attempts that were used allegedly by zookeepers to try to get the pandas to mate. So there was the panda porn, there's exercises or training exercises that were supposed to help strengthen pandas in a way so they had more sexual stamina. There was orchestrated, allegedly, threesomes, vibrators, speed dating, Viagra. And when I asked panda scientists about this, some of these were in fact used and considered effective, like I know Viagra was, and then others of them, like panda porn, at least according to the San Diego Zoo scientists, weren't actually really used. And this is, so the panda porn thing originated with a collaboration between the World Wildlife Fund and the free pornography website Pornhub. And what this was actually humans dressed up as pandas having sex. And it was marketed as a way to help male pandas get in the mood. There's like a whole accompanying animation video, and they were also raising funds for panda conservation. I'm going to skip this one for the sake of time, but this is a New York Times article that has similar discourse around pandas not showing the sort of natural inclinations, quote unquote natural, they would, because of the conditions of captivity made them supposedly like sexually deficient. And so there was a shift in the 2010s from this rhetoric to actually talking instead about mate compatibility. And it was surrounding this 2017 article in particular that found that if pandas were allowed to choose their mate, then they were a lot more likely to go through with the mating and then have cubs like following that. And this is the main article. It's titled "Do Opposites Attract," and it came out of the San Diego Zoo too. And what I find interesting about this one is that the title sort of reflects this heterosexual framing of men and women as supposedly opposite sexes, and it also references this idea of sexual complementarity, that male and female sexualities are polar opposites that complement one another and are determined by biology. And the scientists behind this paper did a series of media interviews and wrote a few op-eds. And so they were really key in propagating this idea in the media that pandas needed romance in order to really get into the mood. And so there's this shift from talking about like a crisis of masculinity happening in captive breeding programs in the earlier time period to now instead talking about these heteronormative framings of dating and romance. And so we see the gendered rhetoric in the media shifting as scientists shift their understanding of what was happening in captive breeding programs. And so I'll just, here's some like quotes that really illustrate this. So the first one reads that females were twice as likely to give birth to cubs if their partner was a love interest rather than a boring guy next door. So here we see like an invocation of heterosexual tropes around dating and romance. And the second one here also invokes a racialized element. So this quote is from National Geographic, and they are trying to say why having pandas pick their mates is much better than panda scientists sort of matching the pandas based on genetics. And they say that unsatisfying arranged marriages are all too common for pandas. And so what they're referring to here is that having that mate choice sort of gives a more modern spin to the way that pandas reproduce. And it is like an Orientalist reference to associations of Chinese relationships being brought about through arranged marriages. So we see not just gender here, but also race and ethnicity. And then this is, so the debates around the proper role of male aggression in panda mating really resurfaced when in 2018, there was the first recording of pandas mating in the wild. It's really hard to see them in the wild, so this was sort of the first time that there was actual footage, and it got picked up by the Washington Times and then later Fox News, where instead of male pandas being seen as sexually deficient, they were portrayed as being excessively sexually aggressive. And so again, like what I want to highlight here is that we have this preoccupation with masculinity and the future of masculinity that gets resurfaced as our understandings of panda mating evolve over time. So the quote, is that pandas are tough, sexually potent survivors, not the hapless bunglers we created as zoo attractions. And that the male that wins competitions for the female has sex over 40 times in a single afternoon. And in the documentary, they say that, quote, the males hold the female hostage in a tree and sort of compete for her. And so again, this is bringing up the narratives around like heterosexual or heteronormative tropes. This is the Fox News portrayal of it. So I'll just close by emphasizing my main point. So the reproduction of endangered species are articulated through these cultural anxieties about the perceived crisis of the future of masculinity and heterosexuality. So we see the role of anthropomorphism and heteronormativity that arises in imagining possible environmental futures for us and other species. So thank you all for having me. I really look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Meg. We'll now turn it over to Jess Eisen for wonderful comments, I'm sure. Do you want to say that? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Hi, Meg.
Hi.
You see me okay? Nice to meet you. So thank you so much for this really, really interesting paper. This was something I'd sort of noted in passing in the culture, the odd ways that people talk about panda breeding programs. And I really learned a ton from reading your paper, and I really appreciate this sort of attempt to create these kind of time periods to organize the different ways that the discourse was changing over time. So this sort of discourse analysis that you present raised a couple of sort of small questions that I want to put to you, but then I want to kind of pivot to talk more generally about some thoughts I had about the feminist framing and some questions that raised for me more broadly. So first of all, I found that there were a few places in the paper where the discussions of where you came in with your analysis of the narrative that you were describing, where I wanted to hear more of what you had to say. So quite a few times where there was a lot of rich description, and then a note that, this reflects or mirrors a crisis of masculinity in the broader culture, or anxieties around anti-miscegenation, all of which I thought could be topic sentences for a new paragraph as opposed to a conclusion to a narrative. So this could be just a disciplinary curiosity because you're working in history, and my own priors are sort of in law. So maybe my sort of drive to the normative is stronger than is appropriate for a history paper. So the one reader's take was that I wanted to kind of really see the paper get in more to this explanation of, what is the crisis of masculinity in the broader culture that you're seeing evoked, and sort of drawing out more closely the elements of that public discourse that really show that. And I was kind of picturing the skeptical reader, someone who didn't automatically agree. Would you want to maybe add a little bit more elaboration to bring them on side? There was also a point in the plot of the narrative that you describe, if we can think of it that way, that left me with some questions, which was in particular the shift that came about with the uncuddly truth about pandas, and that we see this conversation moving towards actually attending to the little information that was available about panda mating in more natural environments, and sort of identifying maybe captivity as being part of the problem with these breeding programs. And this possible, when you were giving your presentation, you mentioned 2018 as being the date on that article. And equally possible that I misread it, but it's possible that the paper says 2010. because I remember seeing that and thinking, why in 2010 would things change? And I thought maybe this came shortly after Blackfish, when people started actually thinking about captivity as being something that's bad for some kinds of animals. And I looked up when was Blackfish, and it was 2013. And I was like, oh, that can't be the answer then. But if it was 2018, then maybe there's a broader explanation for that shift in the culture, because the other shift you note about the focus on compatibility came from what I understand from the paper, actual advances within the scientific literature on this topic. But I really wondered what it is that happened that made people start digging up this old information that had been available since the 80s, as I understood it, about what wild mating in pandas looked like versus in captivity. So I at least was wondering what you saw as driving that second shift. Why in 2018 or 2010, if I didn't misread, we see this kind of renewed interest in actual captivity as part of the problem. But those are sort of my smaller points. I wanted to turn to a broader question that I had coming out of this, relating to the feminist approach taken in the paper. So the analysis that you present here is obviously feminist in the sense that it imports feminist politics and critiques to identify some of the gender stereotypes that you see present in the paper. And I've been thinking a lot lately in connection with a handbook chapter that I've been working on about what makes some work within animal studies and animal law in particular, but I think it's more generalizable. What makes some animal studies work feminist? And so I've been thinking about a few different features, some of which I see in this work and some of which I wanted to sort of gauge your sense of its potential relevance. So I've been thinking about this kind of triptych of work that is feminist on the level of analogy, intersection, or analysis. So in terms of analogy, we can think about work that tries to draw parallels between the representational harms or the material and physical harms experienced by women or sexual minorities as parallel to those experienced by animals. By intersection, I mean, we're not necessarily looking at the harms, but we're looking at sort of co-produced systems of hierarchy and abuse. So we see this on the micro level with research on, for example, the domestic violence context, where you see sort of a relationship very immediate between those two kinds of violence. But also on the macro level, we've been talking a lot about capitalism as a driver of all different kinds of oppression. That seems like a frame that is trying to link the kind of larger structures involved in feminist and animal studies analysis. And finally, in terms of the analytic frameworks that I think make some work feminist, we see, for example, drawing on care ethics that have been developed explicitly in a feminist context, or drawing on what in legal theory is sometimes referred to as feminist method, which is sort of a fancy way of saying just listening to the voices of women, particularly in feminist theory, as being relevant to understanding law and policy questions. So this work, I thought, really locates within this idea of sort of analogy around representational harms. So looking at the ways that our discursive relationship with sex and gender ends up being analogized to the way that this is discussed in the context of panda mating and reproduction. But I found myself wondering about whether there might be connections to some of those other kinds of feminist analysis lurking in the background of the paper. And so I wanted to put to you some of the ways that I saw these other kinds of analogies or intersections maybe in the background, and see if any of that is helpful to you or fruitful as you think through this piece. So one of these had to do with the material harms that are behind the representations that you study. And obviously feminists have lots to offer in terms of analysis of sex that is unchosen or coerced or pursuing somebody else's agenda. So I found myself wanting to know more about the material harms in terms of forced sex in this context. And I did a little Googling on this because I am aware in the dairying context of a technique used to extract semen to use for artificial insemination in that context called electroejaculation, which is as bad as it sounds. And there is a reference to artificial insemination as being used as an alternative in panda reproduction. And so I did a quick Google, and this is in fact the method that is used when they can't actually get pandas to have an interest in sex. They, engage in this process of electroejaculation, which without detailing, I will just say, as I said, as bad as it sounds. So the second kind of piece that I was interested to hear more about was whether there might be some lessons from feminist method that could be brought forward in this paper. So method embracing what counts as knowledge, what sources are authoritative. And if we follow this methodological approach in this context, it really compels us to ask what the pandas experience behind all of this is. So we get a distinct sense in this work that the question of how pandas are experiencing this reproduction is not really meaningfully present in these media representations. And I think the paper does a really good job of showing the way that human beings are clouded by their own sort of agendas, framings, to view things in a certain way rather than actually consulting the experiences of the pandas in these programs. But although this critique is there of the media representations, I didn't get the sense that the attempt to fill that void, to bring the voices and experiences of those pandas forward was a big part of your own analysis here. And I know that this is a tough thing to do. I think even with animals that are that human beings think they understand better, it's often kind of difficult to look through the scientific literature to find what look like traces of actual evidence of the experiences in issue here. So here we know that these animals are rare and difficult to observe in nature, as you identify in your paper. But I thought it might be useful to think about maybe even just offering some more context and explanation for some of the scientific language that the paper draws on to explain the inner lives of the pandas here. So a few examples of places where scientific language was used in a way that I found distancing, that might have brought us closer if there was more explanation is references to pandas as having different levels of aggressiveness. I wondered, there obviously, it seemed clear to me from your paper that they have metrics on which they identify which pandas are aggressive and which are not. I was curious, what are the characteristics of an aggressive panda? What are they using to create this label? Same with fearfulness. There was talk of low fearful and high fearful pandas. This is telling us something about how pandas express their experience, but I found myself wondering what it was. What does life expression look like for a low fearful panda versus a high fearful panda? Same with excitability, food anticipatory. I think in a lot of these places, the use of that scientific language left me feeling far away from the experiences of the pandas in a way where even a little bit of explanation could have brought us closer. So I offer this noting that you might choose not to pursue any of the other avenues of material analogy or intersections between systems of oppression or method and voice that I've highlighted as potential avenues. But I think it's possible that drawing on some of these frames could help you deepen or share with the audience what you see as the stakes in the discourse analysis that you so artfully present here. So I know you rely in many parts in the paper on Donna Haraway's primate visions. And I think Haraway's work is a good example of a discourse analysis that sort of adds this layer of explaining the way that the analogies in the level of discourse have a relationship between systems of interlocking hierarchy. So I think In your work, we see our eye really drawn to these discursive analogies, and throughout we see this language of resonating, referencing, drawing upon, mirroring tropes of human sexuality. And I thought this was all incredibly intriguing and thought-provoking, but that we might make, you might consider making more explicit the commitments that motivate why you want to draw our attention to these analogies. Why does it matter for women or for minoritized sexual groups or whoever in the human communities that humans are drawing these resonant comparisons? And why does it matter for pandas? And I think some of these other lines of feminist inquiry might lead you to sort of bring some of those themes closer to the surface. But once again, this was an extremely fascinating paper. I learned a ton, and I look forward to following your work. Congratulations on completing your degree.
Thank you. Those comments were really helpful and really thoughtful. So thank you so much. They're really, I think, going to improve the paper going forward. I can address a couple of things real quick before we turn to Q&A. The first being, so the main problem with studying pandas in wild context is that they live sort of alone and are very hard to observe. So there was the initial sort of 1980 study that there was only 2 recorded events of mating that the scientist that was able to observe, and that was the basis for sort of the development of the captive breeding program. So there was like very little knowledge known, and during that time, so like persistently since then, scientists have been trying to get footage of this and haven't been able to. And so what happened in 2018 was that a film team was actually able to see they were making like a panda documentary, and they happened to be able to see a mating event. And so that was the first time that it was recorded and then sort of shared among the panda scientist communities in the US and China. And that's what motivated this shift in 2018. And yeah, it wasn't 2010, it was 2018 for really identifying captivity as part of the problem. So that was that. The next question of like what makes my work feminist, that's like a really important question. So thank you so much for raising that. The way I see it is first, the sort of method or approach is feminist in that I closely attend to gender and sexuality throughout my analysis. This comes from like my training in feminist science studies. And then the second level is that my book project is really motivated by what I see as feminist values. So the desire to like alleviate oppression, both of humans and animals. And I agree that these discursive constructions really perpetuate systems of oppression. And that's what got me interested in the topic and what keeps me excited about this work. In terms of the experience of pandas, that's so that's really important. And I agree that it's not really present so much in this paper, but I can tell you a bit about what I've learned from, so I did a bunch of interviews with scientists as part of my sort of method and approach. And I asked them specifically about how do you know if the panda is fearful or if it's aggressive? Like there's no definitions in the scientific papers, even for ones that are supposed to be personality profiles of them. And the answers I got was that it was like self-evident. I wasn't really given a lot of detail, even though I kept sort of asking. The next piece of this is that I don't think the experience for pandas is good. They're, I think, really struggling, and that the difficulty with reproduction is evidence of sort of the pandas' experience in zoos as not, that they're not able to thrive in those contexts. And I've gotten at this a little bit with talking with panda scientists about stress alleviation initiatives. So things that such as like enrichment for their like enclosures as methods of trying to get them to reproduce better. So so there's evidence that there are sort of real material harms happening to pandas. In terms of my own sort of thinking about like theorizing that, I think the direction that I might be going with this paper is to really think about the construction of reproductive justice more broadly and what it looks like in this context. Especially sort of reimagining it as an ecological construction. What I think is happening is that there's this overemphasis sort of on getting pandas to reproduce in captivity when there aren't really actually, there hasn't been any successful release of pandas back into the wild. There's been a couple of attempts and the pandas have died. So what the pandas are being, so China owns all of the pandas and they live sort of just primarily in zoo context. So if we think of sort of reproductive justice more broadly, like what does it mean that there is sort of these crises of extinction and that pandas aren't really able to return to their native habitat and reproduce there and are instead are being are reproducing, but it's just to live in zoos. So yeah, I'll turn it over to questions. And thank you again for the comments. They were really helpful.
If we can get a mic to Victoria.
Hi, can you all hear me well?
Yeah.
All right, good. Yeah, thanks so much for your presentation. So there are a few things that I wanted to remark on that I found interesting. So firstly, to get this out of the way, after hearing that, I really don't want to be told anymore that vegans anthropomorphize animals too much. And okay, to get into more deeply what I wanted to comment on, I find it's interesting, this tension, and this is something that, I mean, this is something that I've observed previously, but like it particularly comes through in your presentation, just about how these animals are portrayed as sexless and as being pathologically so, but then over-sexualized at the same time, or hypersexualized at the same time, or made into hyper heterosexual creatures. And I've often noticed how animals are portrayed as sexless and desexualized often. And in my own research, I find that quite puzzling, of course, like seeing as Darwin wrote so rapturously about sexual attraction and sexual desire really being one of the major driving forces of evolution in the animal kingdom. And but I find that in a lot of people's day-to-day relationships with other animals, there's this desexualization going on, or sometimes people will want to see the animals as sexless for various reasons, like quote unquote pets, for instance, where they are often sterilized. And I think that for some people, there is really this anxiety over the sexuality of the animal and over the reproductive capacity of the animal. And it's almost seen as like that the animals are made safer if they're sexless, or they're easier to project onto if they're sexless, or they're seen as giving the human quote unquote owner some more emotional gratification of some kind if they're desexualized. And I think and that was what came to my mind, like in terms of what you were talking about the pandas, but then also like just how, and I think this is what ties in like also with Jess's comments about bringing other dimensions of oppression into your discussion as well, about just how like the sexuality of the pandas was really pathologized in a way as well, like where they were portrayed as being like abnormally sexless, or that they needed some kind of grotesque medical intervention to fix that. And then also, and also like the pathologization, of course, of queerness, of homosexuality, and like there's just that other dimension of that as well. And it's just very strange because, I mean, from my perspective, like hearing this and thinking about this, it's that like they're forcibly masturbating these animals with vibrators to try to get them to be sexually active. And to me, it's just like, well, of course, naturally, these animals don't feel horny, and it's just very bizarre and contradictory to me. And I wanted to ask if you have thought about that or could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that comes immediately to mind is that when I was doing my interviews with panda scientists, there was one, Megan Martin Wintle at the San Diego Zoo, and she was the one who was responsible for the Do Opposites Attract paper that really brought to the forefront the idea of mate choice. And what she actually told me was that she didn't think that we anthropomorphized pandas enough. And I think by what she meant by that was that that she sees pandas as like having their own personalities and lived experiences and identities, and that needed to be taken into account with captive breeding programs and the conditions of captivity. And she actually also said this in a number of media interviews as well. And so this idea sort of spread from her, which is a really interesting, to me, case of sort of science and culture having an interplay. And in terms of your comment about like the real material harms that the pandas go through, absolutely. I mean, it's not a good experience for pandas in captive breeding programs. And like we might even question if it's ethical to have them all together when they can't really be returned back into the wild. So there's sort of both concerns around the way that it's being done right now, both for the sake of sort of environmentalist ideas and also like animal rights or animal welfare ones. But yeah, and thank you for your comment.
Thanks.
Rose?
Is this, oh, hi, Meg, and thank you so
Hi.
much for such a wonderful paper. I enjoyed, well, I mean, it's weird to say that I enjoyed reading it. It's very well written. It's extremely distressing also. So enjoyment might not be the right word, but amazing paper. I have two small questions. One is, would you be able to say a little bit more or a little bit about what the actual drivers of panda endangerment are, on the one hand? And then on the other hand, I'm curious if you were to sort of look at the broad landscape of panda recovery efforts, what proportion of resources or money is directed at captive breeding? Like, is that the main strategy, or are there other strategies underway? Thanks.
Yeah, those are really important questions. So the primary driver of panda endangerment is habitat loss, especially sort of the bamboo forest. And pandas sort of need to eat kind of all the time because of the way that their biology works. They're evolved from carnivores, but they eat bamboo, so they need to eat large volumes of it because it's sort of not nutrition. It's like not a nutrition dense food. So that's the first part. The second part of the question of panda recovery efforts. So yeah, so captive breeding is the main thing. That's where most of the funding goes. That's where most of the discursive focus is as well, which is why I think it's sort of important to think about to think about the context of habitat loss and in a framework of like reproductive justice, because there isn't, they claim sort of that the captive breeding programs is motivated by the desire to eventually return the pandas to their wild context, but really they're being reproduced in order to be sort of sent to international zoos or go stay as entertainment in Chinese zoos. So that's the main thing. I know there are some like smaller scale efforts to help with habitat loss, but even the way that pandas are raised in captive breeding programs, a lot of times they're raised in cohorts, and so the babies are sort of all happening at once and they sort of grow up together, and that's not the way that like wild panda reproduction works. And so the pandas don't actually develop the correct sort of social systems in order for them to actually exist in the wild. So like from day one, they're not really being given the conditions that would allow them to actually return to the wild.
Okay, great talk, Meg. One thought I had at a few points in your talk was the book Decolonizing Extinction, Juno Perennis book on orangutans in somewhat different circumstances. Like it's a rehabilitation center, but the similar predicament where there is very little prospect of captive breeding leading to wild reintroduction, successful reintroductions in the context of rapidly diminishing habitat. And one of the things she wrestles with in the book is using the word rape. And she says, at what point do we use that word? And I was wondering if that had crossed your thinking here. And then the other thing she wrestles with, there's lots of, it's an incredibly rich book, but one thing in relation to what you were discussing, I kept thinking about was her analogy of a hospice for a dying species, and this sort of emergency work at the edge of extinction and the care that's involved in it, the human care, and what people are willing to live with and do in the service of keeping a species on Earth. And I wonder, to what extent is your work looking at some of the emotional turmoil of the people involved in that care or reproductive management when they're seeing very unwell animals and participating in a certain violence for the sake of a species survival?
Yeah, really great to bring up Juno's work. Yeah, so for the first question, I mean, I don't really go into it in the chapter, but my own view is that like rape is the result of structural oppression and of patriarchy and human oppressive systems. And that's different than just sort of interpersonal violence, which might, which in animals, in my view, often is without the existence of that kind of structural oppression. The conditions of captive breeding, though, bring up sort of a unique case study, sort of as Juno explores, where we do actually have sort of hierarchical systems that that create sort of conditions that escalate interpersonal violence. And the place where I really thought about this was there is a documentary where in it sort of shows male aggression towards females and of the pandas, and the scientists, the way that it was narrated was that this aggression would have been naturally expressed in the wild between males, but because of the conditions of captivity, that aggression was misplaced onto females. And it's quite disturbing in my view, but sort of there doesn't seem to be any kind of self-conscious understanding of it as being like something really morally troublesome, at least as like portrayed in the documentary. What I think is provocative about Juno's work is she talks about the idea of like dying well. So kind of like being understanding that like the most ethical way forward is to find ways of sort of inhabiting extinction sort of in relationship with one another, where there isn't this sort of necessarily that the ethical solution is not always to keep the species around. And well, I mean, that's both like really sad, but my view is that I think there needs to be a lot of shift to looking at preserving ecosystem integrity and maintaining ecosystem functioning, and that is, given the way that climate change and extinction are going, that's the best hope for sort of maintaining multi-species relationships, and that captive breeding takes a whole lot of money and effort and resources, and also has like this ethical cost to it. Whereas if there was instead a focus on maintaining habitats and habitat connectivity, it would sort of circumvent some of those issues. Yeah, thank you for those thoughts. They're really helpful.
And our last question will go to Melissa.
Hello, Meg. Thank you. I have kind of an easy, but also maybe very hard question. So I was just, thank you for your talk and your paper. It was so interesting. And yeah, like Rose was saying, like kind of fun, but also pretty messed up. So I was just curious how you came to this work and what your relationship with pandas is. Because you obviously care a lot about it. So I was just curious.
Yeah. So this is part of a larger book project that is looking at a series of case studies about how the role of gender and sexuality in portraying endangered species. So I have another chapter that's about frogs and the way that estrogenic pollutants have interfered with their sort of sexual biology and systems. And I have another chapter that's about climate change, where I look at the case of birds and turtles, where their reproductive systems are being altered by climate change. And I came to this project in general because I was working at UC Berkeley when I was an undergrad with a scientist who was looking at the case of the frogs and the endocrine disruptors. But I came to the panda case specifically because I found someone sent me the video of the animation about the panda porn, and it's just because people know that I'm studying like gender and sexuality and extinction, and so a friend sent it to me. Like I think he saw it in Scientific American, and I watched the animation, and it's like really striking. Like the female panda has like a little bow, and it's like she's nagging the male panda, and the male panda is uninterested. And then the scientists in the animation come and put the TV in front of the male panda that has the panda porn. And then all of a sudden the male panda is interested. So it was really that. And then I started just kind of Googling about the pandas, and it just how striking the gender and sexual rhetoric was. I was like, okay, this has to be a case study because it's like very blatant. So it makes the analysis fun in a way, but also easy and disturbing. Yeah, thank you.
And before we move to the next paper, I'll use my privilege as the moderator to just make one final quick comment to something that might be of interest to you for this paper or for your research in general, because I saw some interesting parallel about the discourse that you're pointing out about the heteronormativity of the sexuality imposed upon panda through the discourse to Kim Talsberg's work of the state-imposed nature of monogamy and what she calls settler sexuality. So I know she has a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Critical Indigenous Studies that might be used to make that connection to the broader narrative.
Yeah, so the albatross that I study in my climate change chapter, they are considered to be socially monogamous, but that they are birds that are becoming increasingly polyamorous as the result of climate change because of the way that climate change has effects on resource availability. And yeah, so I look at, I use Kim Tallbear's work in that chapter. It's wild.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the great paper.
Yay, thank you all.